What up, A-Push? Time for period 7. This is a big period. It's got 55 years in it. So we're going to kind of break it down into kind of chunks. I think that will help you think about both the sort of different smaller frames in it and then also sort of the connections. You can kind of take a through line all the way from 1890 until 1945 and the end of World War II. So let's start with the sort of idea of U.S. expansion. Up to this point, the United States has been kind of expanding westward over the land, kind of spreading to the west coast and all the way out to here in California. But at this point, the United States now is looking elsewhere, outward, right? So overseas expansion. Some of the reasons for this expansion, obviously we have the sort of 1890s census, which says that the frontier of the United States is closed. And we have that argument by Frederick Jackson Turner called the frontier thesis about why this is going, this sort of is a huge question about what's going to happen in the United States now that the frontier is closed. Teddy Roosevelt, who becomes kind of an imperialist, he is certainly a huge fan of this argument. We also have sort of economic motives, right? Making more money, starting to think about globalizing the sort of influence of America and how can we take this sort of Gilded Age economic growth and find new markets for it. And then of course you have some of the underlying kind of racial theories, right? This idea of the white man's burden of helping these sort of other nations and peoples to lift them up and to educate and to benefit them. Impact-wise, we obviously have the Spanish-American War of 1898. 4 months, pretty short. A splendid little war, as Secretary of State Hay calls it. Remember, that sort of starts with that sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. And what that leads to, of course, is the U.S. gaining some of the territories of Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines, as well as sort of, some sort of protectorate and then eventually independence for Cuba. But so this idea of the Philippines is going to lead to a couple things. There is this sort of extended insurrection of the natives in the Philippines who do not want a new colonial power, the United States, controlling them. And so you see a big pushback. And this sort of protracted sort of conflict, fighting in the Philippines leads to this question about American imperialism. Like, should America be part of this sort of imperialist push that's been happening throughout the 19th century? Or should they sort of heed the calls of the Declaration of Independence and the ideals we were founded on of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all? And so we have this sort of debate between the imperialists, people like Teddy Roosevelt, Alfred T. Mahan, the guy who wrote that book on sort of naval power and how that's really beneficial for geopolitical sort of positioning, versus the sort of anti-imperialists, people like Mark Twain, Henry Cabot Lodge, William Jennings Bryan, these sort of anti-imperialist politicians, academics who are arguing that this is not what America's about. America's not about imperializing. And so that's all kind of happening in these early sort of early period 7, but obviously late 19th, early 20th century. So the next theme is sort of the progressive era. It's not a exact starting and ending point, but it's seen as sort of beginning in 1890 and kind of going until 1920 or so. And the progressives are a group who generally all are pushing for reforming society, right? They want society to be better, and they're looking to better it socially, economically, politically, right? On a local level, state level, and a federal level too. And the idea is that this is going to happen through government reform, right? Progressives want to use government. Remember, populists want to kind of tear down government. They believe government is corrupt and the more government, the worse. Progressives believe that government is actually the solution, that better government and government regulations and reforms will lead to benefits of society. There's obviously an endpoint of that, and there are many progressives who sort of go too far the other way and see the idea of, you see popularity in things like sterilization, obviously social Darwinism, like kind of bad progressive ideas based on sort of those racial theories of white supremacy. But generally, progressives want reforms. They want to change things, right? who are, progressives. They tended to be, middle class, especially women, women in cities, sort of like those who already have some sort of political power to be able to maybe make some changes, make some arguments. Academics in places like Stanford and Yale, and Harvard, who have the ear of politicians to be able to make some of those changes. And obviously they focus on regulations. If you're thinking about some examples, right, like business regulations, for example, that the Sherman Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which we see sort of a big shift between sort of how monopolies are and trusts are sort of treated. We of course have the economy, the creation of the Federal Reserve, the environment, right? Regulations on sort of creating federal land and national parks with people like Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir. We obviously have the focus on democracy, right? Regulating democracy, things like the 17th Amendment that allows for direct election of senators by American citizens. That's a big change, as well as, of course, the culminating 19th Amendment in 1920, which is the amendment that gives women the right to vote. And then, of course, the idea of regulating and changing society, right? We have the muckrakers, these journalists and authors and photographers who are showing us the seamier side of society and how things like the meat industry and the poverty and just horrible treatment of workers and immigrants on the streets of New York City and Boston and Philadelphia and Chicago are leading to this horrible life, this sort of horrible life for these folks. And The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, the ideas of the Hull House and Jane Addams, trying to sort of reform this society and make it better. Obviously, that kind of leads us into World War One. World War One, remember, called the Great War at the time. This is from 1914 to 1918. We don't get into that war until 1917, so we're really only in about a year. We stay out of it for a long time. We try to stay neutral, but things like the Zimmerman telegram, which is that sort of possibly true, possibly not true telegram from Germany to Mexico about possibly them invading the United States, getting involved in the war to get their land back that we got from the Mexican-American War, the sinking of the Lusitania and that sort of unrestricted submarine warfare that was going on. Those kind of things push us in. While that war and sort of things are happening, we obviously see some things happening in the United States at home. Things like restriction of civil liberties, right? You get that Sedition Act and the sort of push against the draft, right? You get that Schenck v. U.S. case where Charles Schenck is arrested for giving out pamphlets arguing that the draft is unconstitutional, and that sort of argument that clear and present danger is during wartime shows that civil liberties can be restricted. You kind of get the Red Scare, that first Red Scare against communism, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Also in domestic life at home, you see increased economic opportunities, right? Especially for women who can now take some new jobs, as well as African Americans, right? African Americans are seeing more opportunities for themselves to both economically benefit from wartime. Many certainly served in the military as well. But also that we see this push toward what's called the Great Migration, the sort of beginnings of the African Americans in the South who had mostly been in the South after the Civil War, start moving north, both for jobs during the wartime, where jobs are, where people are needed to work the factories, where those who have gone off to war have left, but also, of course, to get the hell out of the Jim Crow South, right, and to get away from the segregation and horrible treatment that they are experiencing. We also, of course, see that this is going to lead to, obviously, a clapback with something like, like the Red Summer of 1919, where you get all of the horrible violence and riots going on in that summer of 1919, kind of after the World War One. Of course, the ending of World War One is with the Treaty of Versailles, and the sort of specific setup of the League of Nations, right? This sort of international body that's going to try to reign some sort of peace after this war. And that's kind of based on that Wilson's 14 points sort of speech and this push for kind of a post-war peace, and this body that's going to help sort of regulate and protect that. The League of Nations, of course, is Wilson's idea, but ultimately the U.S. Congress rejects it. They see this as sort of losing the United States' sort of independence, and this argument that going all the way back to George Washington and that we should stay out of foreign alliances and foreign affairs. And so we do not join the League of Nations, even though the League of Nations is created. So this kind of leads us into the 1920s. We have that first Red Scare, of course. The context of that first Red Scare is that we have all of, that sort of second wave of European immigrants, specifically from Eastern and Southern Europe, so places like Italy and Russia and Poland and Greece and places like that. And many of these immigrants are from those areas, right? And there's a lot of labor unrest. And in 1919, you have the success of the Russian Revolution, and that is going to scare many Americans, especially those in power, who see this as a huge problem. And so obviously that leads to a huge amount of suppression, especially on sort of people who are deemed radical. You have those Palmer raids, where sort of A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, kind of rounds up without warrants all of these, supposed radicals and immigrants, and deports them. Amongst them would be Emma Goldman, a famous anarchist, who argues that the freedom of speech and this is what makes America great, and how can you do this unconstitutional thing? That also, of course, leads to in the early 1920s, 1921, and ultimately 1924, you have the Quota Acts, right? The immigration quotas, where immigration is restricted from certain places based on sort of a certain amount of people coming from each country. So these new restrictions are absolutely coming from this sort of radical moment after World War I, especially in the context of the Russian Revolution and communism's success. Obviously, technology is happening, right? This huge improved sort of improving living standards for many Americans, personal mobility, people are able to move around. We get the, obviously cars and automobile, other new sort of transportation, obviously communication, eventually the radio comes out, and this idea of being able to send information directly to the people, advertising, hugely popular and very important. And obviously in the 1920s, you also have a sort of various amounts of conflicts, right? You have conflicts between sort of Christian fundamentalists versus kind of scientific modernists, right? The idea of do we follow the Bible to its word, or is it more about interpretation? The Scopes trial in, I believe, 1925 is a really good example of that sort of conflict. You, of course, have this native-born argument against immigrants and this sort of nativist, xenophobic bent to a lot of the conversation that's happening politically, and the rise of the second KKK. Of course, the sort of racial dynamic of white versus black in this country, again with Jim Crow and segregation in the South, as well as the sort of the violence of the Red Summer and the sort of the pushback against the Great Migration is leading obviously to a lot of racial violence in the North, right? Not just in the South, but in a lot of places where the African American community is moving to cities like Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and Boston and LA and Oakland. You also, of course, have the push kind of between urban and rural, right? 1920 census, the first ever census taken that shows that more people live in cities in America than in the countryside, which is the first time in history that it's happened. So the push toward urbanization has sort of been fulfilled in a lot of ways, and sort of how that changes the way that we think about politics as well, and the power in the cities versus the countryside. And of course, in the 1920s, you have this rise of the Harlem Renaissance, right? The celebration of black culture, black music, writing, poetry, art, people like Langston Hughes, and jazz music, and Louis Armstrong, and sort of all of this sort of celebration of black culture. You also, of course, with this have kind of the rise of black nationalism in some parts. Marcus Garvey, and this idea of sort of, you know, blackness in itself is good, and this idea that is obviously fought against by many other groups, especially black groups, who have been arguing for sort of fitting in and assimilating into the sort of United States. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, the NAACP, this idea that that black radicalism and nationalism is a bad thing. Of course, the 20s, a lot of economic sort of growth in a lot of ways, but of course we have some of the seeds and the seams of this society are starting to sort of show. And make sure to check the causes of the Great Depression, right? This sort of this, you know, you took notes on it, it's going to help you. But some of the things: overproduction, both in industry as well as farming, high tariffs that we put on foreign goods and other countries put on us, sort of this connected global economy that we're going to see sort of leads to some problems as other economies that we're tied to start to fail. And of course, that stock market crash that happens due to that buying on margin and due to sort of overextension and over speculation, sort of typical of the boom bust economies we've seen in the 19th century, but this is to a whole nother scale. Also understand the effects, right? The effects and the reactions of this depression, right? We have huge unemployment, horrible poverty, these sort of little Hoovervilles, little slums being sort of created on the outskirts of towns named after, of course, Herbert Hoover, the president of the time, and focus on the way that Herbert Hoover deals with this Great Depression versus the new president elected in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is going to deal with it. And so that leads us to sort of the New Deal, right? The way in which the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform, the short-term, medium-term, and long-term recovery, reform, these new changes and regulations are gonna try to help mitigate some of the problems of the Great Depression. And remember, this is a through line from that progressive era, right? FDR is a progressive in a lot of ways, and so you can sort of make a connection back to the progressive era and how FDR and the Democrats of the time take these ideas of the progressive era and bring them into these sort of regulations on business and the economy and the government and the role of government. Also understand, obviously, some of the challenges, right? Like the Supreme Court is full of justices who have been appointed by Republicans, and they do not like this idea of a hugely expanding government. And so many of them, they strike down some of the New Deal programs. You also, of course, have then Roosevelt's reaction to possibly pack the court, adding Supreme Court justices, which becomes a hugely problematic political argument. You, of course, have some radicals like Huey Long, Father John Coughlin, who are arguing actually that the New Deal doesn't go far enough, that sort of argument for far more populism and sort of like, destroying the banks, destroying the sort of the powers that be to rip up the system, as well as socialists who are arguing the same thing. So, and also, of course, think about the impacts, right, of the New Deal. Think about the legacy of reforms and regulations and agencies, the Social Security Act, the FDIC, this idea of the protection of unions and the Wagner Act, things like that. And also, of course, one of the impacts that you need to definitely take into account is the political realignment, how politics changes. Specifically, African Americans and union members become Democrats, right? Capital D, Democrats. And this changes the Democratic Party and the Republican Party from that sort of like 19th century, early 20th century Democratic and Republican parties into what feels a little bit more familiar. And that comes from this, and it kind of continues and throughout the 50s and then into the 60s, where the parties of today are kind of more entrenched with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then finally, World War II, right? You obviously have the United States staying neutral, and I would say neutral because, of course, the Lend-Lease Act, the embargo on Japanese oil, we were really kind of siding with the Allies, even though we were neutral. And then, of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 7th of 1941 leads us to enter the war against Japan and ultimately Germany. Obviously, the mass mobilization of the economy, right? This is what gets us out of the Great Depression. It is not the New Deal. It is really this sort of collectivism of the wartime war powers acts that get us rather out of the Great Depression. Obviously, this is also going to add a lot more opportunities for African Americans, for women. The Great Migration picks up even more so. Women are working outside of the house, and a lot of the sort of the sort of you can see the through line from the argument for women's rights to the 19th Amendment to now women are working in factories making the munitions that are going off to help us fight against the Nazis and the Japanese. And then, of course, what's happening at home in America, right? You have, of course, people growing victory gardens, mass mobilization to focus on, sort of the war effort. Feels very sort of similar to what we're talking about now in the time of coronavirus. How do we sort of mobilize and create solidarity? And sort of this idea of wartime production, right? Like jumping through the hoops to try to get things done as soon as we possibly can. But also, of course, we have things like the Japanese internment, right? Executive Order 9066 that basically puts both Japanese immigrants as well as Japanese American citizens in internment camps, right? Remember the Korematsu v. United States case in 1944? That's really helpful to think about, sort of especially for the DBQ that you guys are going to be writing this week. And then, of course, the debates around race and segregation, things like the Double V campaign pushed by African American newspapers around the sort of victory at home and victory abroad. We're going to beat the Nazis in Europe, but also we're going to beat segregation and racism at home, as well as sort of some of the experiences of the Latinx community, right? The community, especially in California. During World War II, you have lots of undocumented people who are really being brought in purposefully to help farm crops and get food for the American war effort. You obviously have pushes against the sort of new influx of Mexican Americans, specifically Central Americans, and police brutality. There's kind of a Zoot Suit riot, the famous riots that are happening in Los Angeles during the 1940s, during the war. And of course the atomic bombs, right? The dropping of the bombs in August of 1945, and sort of the debate over ending the war this way, right? We're going to end it quickly. We're going to stop the sort of the possible invasion of Japan, but also sort of flex at the Soviet Union and show them what we got. And some of the questions about whether or not that was the right move, which we talked about obviously in class. And just sort of as a coda, thinking about the sort of post-war world this sets up, right? The superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union, and how this is going to lead to the Cold War, sort of, and how Harry Truman will kind of flex at Joseph Stalin and the Soviets during this time, and kind of into Period 8, which we will cover in another video at another time. So I hope this has been helpful. As always, let me know if there's anything I can answer in terms of questions you have specifically. I hope you are well. Take care of yourselves, and enjoy.